They called it well-deserved. A 55-foot trawler, steel hull, twin diesels, built to cross oceans without refueling. Worth over $300,000, a lifetime of savings turned into floating independence. Thomas and Jackie Hawks had earned it. Decades of work, years sailing the Sea of Cortez, a retirement dream made real. On November 15, 2004, they took a buyer out for a sea trial. Standard procedure: a wealthy man, a pregnant wife, a baby on deck. 7 miles offshore, 5 people were aboard. 6 hours later, 3 returned. The boat came back. The owners didn't. And the anchor, 65 pounds of galvanized steel designed to hold the vessel secure, was gone. This is the dark story of the well-deserved yacht. We'll cover the vessel's history, the psychology of maritime trust, the mechanics of the crime, the missing evidence, and the trial that convicted 3 people of murder without ever finding the bodies. Everyone was present. Everything was signed. And still, 2 people vanished into the Pacific. Was this the ocean hiding a crime, or a system that never looked hard enough? The paperwork was perfect. The signatures were real. The transaction was legal. So, why did these 2 people never touch land again? And what does a missing anchor have to do with it? They named the boat well-deserved not as aspiration, but as fact. Thomas and Jackie Hawks had earned this. 30 years of marriage. Decades of work. A life measured not in possessions, but in the slow accumulation of small freedoms. The boat wasn't purchased in a moment of impulse. It wasn't financed. It wasn't rented for a season to see if they liked it. They bought it outright. Cash. The way people used to buy things when they meant them. A 55-foot trawler. Steel hull. Twin diesels. Range. 2,000 nautical miles without refueling. Not a speedboat. Not a toy. A trawler is a vessel designed for one purpose: distance. It moves slowly, burns fuel efficiently, and survives weather that would shatter lighter boats. It's built for people who don't need to arrive quickly. People who've already arrived. The Hawks kept the boat in Newport Beach, California, but they didn't live there. They lived aboard. For years, they sailed the Sea of Cortez, the body of water between mainland Mexico and the Baja Peninsula. 1,000 miles of protected cruising. Warm water, small fishing villages, anchorages that don't appear on charts. The kind of sailing that isn't about showing off. It's about disappearing correctly. The boat had 3 staterooms, a full galley with a propane stove, refrigeration, and enough storage for 3 weeks of provisions. The salon, what landlocked people would call a living room, had wraparound windows, teak cabinetry, and a chart table where Jackie plotted their routes by hand. No GPS in the early years. Paper charts, parallel rulers, dividers, the old methods, the reliable ones. Below decks, the engine room was spotless. Thomas maintained it himself. Oil changes every 100 hours. Fuel filters replaced on schedule. Seacocks greased. Hoses inspected. A trawler's engine room isn't romantic, but it's the heart of the vessel. 1,600 pounds of machinery that turns fuel into motion. When you're 200 miles from the nearest harbor, that engine is the only thing between you and drift. The boat wasn't fast. 7 knots under power. Maybe 9 if you pushed it. That's 8 miles per hour. A walking pace on water. But speed isn't the point. The point is independence. The point is waking up in a different cove every morning if you want to. The point is that no one can find you unless you want to be found. Trawlers attract a specific kind of person. Retired engineers. Former military. People who've spent their lives in systems and want out. People who understand that freedom isn't about going faster. It's about going farther from the things that don't matter. The Hawks fit that profile exactly. They weren't running from anything. They were running towards something. A second life. A life offshore. The boat cost them roughly $300,000. That's not yacht money. That's not oligarch money. That's middle-class couple who saved everything money. It represented decades of work. Thomas had been a probation officer. Jackie, a social worker. They hadn't inherited wealth. They hadn't gotten lucky in the market. They'd simply put money aside, year after year, and refused to spend it on things that didn't bring them closer to this. And for a while, it worked. They had their floating home. They had their roots. They had a community of other cruisers, people who live the same way, who understand the same things. You see the same boats in the same anchorages. You share weather reports over VHF radio. You help each other with engine problems, medical issues, visa paperwork. There's a code, not written, not enforced by law, but absolute. The code says, if someone's in trouble, you help. If someone's dragging anchor in a storm, you wake up and help them reset it. If someone's out of fuel, you siphon from your own tank. If someone's sick, you run them to shore. You do this because someday you'll be the one who needs help. And when that day comes, the only thing between you and catastrophe is whether someone else follows the same code. This code is why the Hawks trusted people. It's why they believed in the goodness of strangers. It's why they let people aboard their boat. It's why they died. In the summer of 2004, Jackie's daughter gave birth, a grandchild. The Hawks had been sailing for years, but this changed the equation. They wanted to be present. They wanted to be nearby. They wanted to stop moving. Selling the boat wasn't an easy decision. It wasn't financial. It was emotional. The boat wasn't just property. It was identity. It was proof that they'd done it, that they'd escaped the ordinary and lived the life most people only talk about. Selling it meant admitting that chapter was over. But they were pragmatic. They weren't sentimental in a way that clouds judgment. The boat had served its purpose. Now it was time to let someone else have that life. Someone younger, someone just beginning. They listed the boat for $260,000. A fair price, not inflated, not desperate. They wanted someone who would take care of it. Someone who understood what it represented. The listing described the boat in detail. Length overall, 55 feet. Beam, 17 feet. Draft, 4.5 feet. Displacement, 55,000 pounds. That's the weight of the boat in water, not counting fuel, provisions, or equipment. Just the hull, the engine, the structure. 55,000 pounds of floating steel. Fuel capacity, 800 gallons. At 7 knots, burning roughly 4 gallons per hour. That's 200 hours of continuous cruising. 1,400 miles without stopping. You could leave California and reach Mexico. You could leave Mexico and reach Central America. You could disappear for weeks and never touch land. The boat had 2 anchors. The primary was a 65-pound CQR, a plow-style anchor designed for holding power in mud, sand, or rock. The secondary was a Danforth, lighter, used for temporary stops. Both were stored in the forward anchor locker, accessible from the deck. The chain was 3/8-inch galvanized steel, 200 feet long, 1,200 pounds of chain. When you drop that anchor, it doesn't drag, it doesn't slip, it holds. The Hawks kept the boat immaculate. No rust, no stains, no deferred maintenance. When potential buyers came aboard, they saw a vessel that had been loved. Teak decks oiled, stainless steel polished, engine hours logged, service records kept. This wasn't a boat being sold because something was wrong. It was being sold because life had changed. Several buyers came and went. Some didn't have the money. Some didn't understand what a trawler was for. Some wanted something faster, sleeker, more impressive to guests. The Hawks didn't care. They were patient. The right buyer would come. And then he did. His name was Skylar DeLeon. He was 25 years old. He told the Hawks he was a wealth manager. He told them he had clients. He told them he was buying the boat as an investment, a floating office for entertaining high net worth individuals off the coast. He told them he loved the ocean. He told them he wanted his family to grow up on the water, the way he had. He brought his wife, Jennifer. She was pregnant, visibly pregnant. 3rd trimester. They also brought their infant daughter, a baby, maybe 6 months old, carried in a sling. Quiet, well-behaved. This is important. This is the detail that mattered more than anything Schuyler said. He didn't come alone. He didn't come with business partners or advisors. He came with a pregnant wife and a baby. And in the psychology of trust, that combination is almost impossible to override. A pregnant woman signals stability. It signals responsibility. It signals that someone is thinking beyond themselves, beyond the present moment. A baby signals innocence. It signals that this person is a caretaker, a protector, someone who understands fragility. Together, they signal, this is a family. This is someone building a life. This is someone who will treat your boat with respect. The Hawks invited them aboard. They walked them through the layout, showed them the engine, demonstrated the electrical systems, explained the water maker, the refrigeration, the navigation equipment. Schuyler asked good questions. He knew the right terminology. He knew the difference between a trawler and a cruiser. He knew why draft mattered. He knew what the fuel range meant. Jennifer was quiet. She smiled. She held the baby. She looked around the salon with the kind of expression people have when they're imagining their future. The Hawks saw this and felt something close to relief. They weren't just selling a boat. They were passing it on to people who would understand it. They sat together in the galley, drank coffee. Schuyler showed them photos on his phone, other boats he'd looked at, marinas he'd visited, places he wanted to take his family. He talked about sailing the Pacific, about teaching his daughter to swim in open water, about raising kids who weren't afraid of the world. The Hawks listened. They nodded. They saw themselves in him, or rather, they saw the people they used to be. The young couple just starting out. The ones who believed that if you worked hard and made good decisions, you could build a life that felt like freedom. Schuyler made an offer. $260,000. Full asking price. No negotiation. Cash deal. He said he'd have the money wired within a week. He just needed to take the boat out for a sea trial first. Standard procedure. He wanted to make sure the engines ran clean under load. Wanted to test the steering, the autopilot, the electronics. Wanted to feel how the boat handled offshore. The Hawks agreed. Of course they agreed. A sea trial is standard. It's expected. No one buys a boat without taking it out. It's not about distrust. It's about due diligence. You need to know how the vessel behaves in real conditions. You need to hear the engine when it's working hard. You need to see how the hull tracks through swell. But there's something most people don't understand about sea trials on a boat this size. The seller has to go. Not just the seller, both sellers if it's a couple. You don't hand over a 55-foot boat to a stranger and wave from the dock. You go with them. You operate the systems. You demonstrate the features. You answer questions in real time. You're the instructor. The buyer is the student. This is normal. This is how it works. Every cruiser who's ever sold a boat has done it this way. You go offshore together. You run through the checklist. You spend a few hours at sea. Then you come back, shake hands, and finalize the paperwork. No one brings witnesses. No one brings a lawyer. It's just the buyer and the seller, alone on a boat, miles from shore, because that's the only way to do it. You can't test a boat in a harbor. You need open water. You need distance. You need isolation. The Hawks set a date. November 15th, 2004. A Monday. Weather was clear. Light wind. Calm seas. Perfect conditions. They didn't tell anyone they were nervous. They weren't nervous. Why would they be nervous? They'd done this before. They'd taken other buyers out. They'd spent years around strangers in foreign harbors. They knew how to read people. Skylar seemed fine. Jennifer seemed sweet. The baby was there. Babies don't lie. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Skylar Delian wasn't a wealth manager. He didn't have clients. He didn't have money. He had debt, criminal history, a pattern of fraud and petty theft stretching back to his teenage years. He'd been a child actor, briefly, a background extra on Power Rangers, 1 episode, no lines. But he told people he'd been a star. He told people he had connections in Hollywood. He told people he was about to land a big deal, a big contract, a big break. None of it was true. Jennifer knew. She knew he was lying. She knew they didn't have money for a boat. She knew what he was planning. And she went anyway. She brought the baby anyway. She smiled anyway. On the morning of November 15th, the Hawks woke early. They prepared the boat, topped off the fuel, checked the engine oil, verified that the electronics were working. They weren't worried. They were careful. Careful people do careful things. Skylar arrived at the dock at 10 a.m. He wasn't alone. He brought 2 men, Alonzo Machain, John Kennedy. He introduced them as friends, fellow investors. They wanted to see the boat too. They were thinking about going in together on the purchase. This should have been a warning. This should have stopped everything, but it didn't. Because it's not unusual for a buyer to bring someone with experience. A surveyor, a mechanic, a friend who knows boats. You want a second opinion. You want someone to confirm you're making a smart decision. The Hawks welcomed them aboard. All 4 of them. Skylar, Jennifer, Alonzo, John. The baby stayed behind this time, left with a relative. That should have been another warning, but it wasn't. People rationalize. People trust. The boat left the dock at 10:30 a.m. Thomas piloted. Jackie prepared coffee in the galley. Skylar and his friends stood on the back deck, talking, pointing at the coastline as it receded. They motored west, out of the harbor, past the breakwater, into open water. Newport Beach disappeared behind them. The water deepened. The color changed from green to blue to black. Cell phone signal faded. The hum of the engine became the only sound. The horizon became the only landmark. They were 3 miles offshore when the masks came off. There's a rule in maritime sales that isn't written anywhere. It isn't taught in boating classes. It isn't posted at marinas, but every seller knows it. Every buyer knows it. The rule is simple. The sea trial happens offshore. Not in the harbor. Not in protected water. Not where other boats can see you. Offshore. Miles from land. Where the boat can reach cruising speed. Where the engine can run at full throttle. Where the hull can move through real swell and show you how it behaves when it matters. This means the seller has to go. Both sellers, if it's a couple. You can't demonstrate a boat from shore. You can't explain the systems remotely. You have to be there. You have to show them how the autopilot engages, how the anchor windlass operates, how the electrical panel is organized, where the through hulls are, which seacocks control what. You're alone with strangers, miles from help, no witnesses, no backup. Just you, them, and a 55,000-pound vessel in open water. This is normal. This is how it's always been done. The risk is invisible because it's everywhere. Like swimming in the ocean and not thinking about depth. The danger isn't something you can see. It's something you're already inside. Thomas Hawk stood at the helm. Jackie was below in the galley, preparing coffee. The boat moved smoothly through low swell. 6 knots, engine temperature normal, oil pressure steady. Everything running exactly as it should. Skylar Delian stood near the back deck with Alonzo Machain and John Kennedy. They weren't talking much now. They were watching the coastline shrink, watching the distance grow, watching the water change from recreational blue to navigational black. The color that tells you the bottom is no longer close. 3 miles offshore. 5 miles. 7. The VHF radio was on. Channel 16. The international hailing and distress frequency. It crackled occasionally with distant transmissions, Coast Guard updates, fishing boats coordinating, recreational sailors checking in with their marinas, normal traffic, the sounds of a functioning system. But the system only works if you're close enough to reach it. Radio range is limited. VHF is line of sight. Once you're far enough out, once the curvature of the Earth drops the antennas below the horizon, the radio becomes a device that speaks into silence. You can transmit. No one hears. Cell phones stopped working around 2 miles out. Not dead, just searching. The little icon that spins endlessly, looking for a tower that isn't there. By the time they were 7 miles offshore, the phones were ornamental. Expensive paperweights. Thomas was explaining something about the fuel management system. 2 tanks, port and starboard. You could run off one or both, or switch between them to balance the weight. It's the kind of detail that matters on a long passage. The kind of thing an experienced buyer would want to know. Schuyler wasn't listening anymore. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a stun gun. Compact. Black. The kind designed for personal defense. 50,000 volts. Enough to override the nervous system. Enough to drop someone without killing them. Enough to take control without making noise. Alonso and John pulled out theirs at the same time. 3 stun guns. Coordinated, planned. Thomas turned, saw them, understood immediately. Not gradually, not with confusion. Immediately. The way people understand car crashes in the half-second before impact. The brain processes everything at once. The weapons, the expressions, the distance from shore, the isolation, the trap. He didn't fight. There was no point. He was 77 years old. Jackie was 62. Between them, they weighed maybe 280 pounds. Schuyler, Alonso, and John were younger, heavier, armed, and prepared. The math was simple. Resistance would only make it worse. Jackie came up from the galley, saw the weapons, froze. Thomas told her not to move, told her to stay calm, told her it would be okay. It wouldn't be okay. He knew that. But you say it anyway, because the alternative is admitting that the situation is exactly as bad as it appears. Schuyler's voice changed. Not loud, not angry, just different. The tone people use when they're done pretending. Flat, efficient, the voice of someone who's made a decision and is now executing it. He told them to sit down. Thomas and Jackie sat. On the deck, backs against the cabin wall. Schuyler told them not to move. They didn't move. This is the moment where the crime changes shape. Up until now, it could have been robbery. Take the cash, take the jewelry, take whatever's valuable, and leave. But robbery requires an exit. It requires the criminals to get off the boat and disappear. That's not what was happening here. What was happening here was a takeover. Not of the boat, of the transaction. Schuyler didn't want to steal the boat. He wanted to own it. Legally. With paperwork. With transferable title. With access to the bank accounts. The insurance. The equity. He wanted what the Hawks had built, but he wanted it to look legitimate. To do that, he needed their cooperation. He needed their signatures. He needed them to participate in their own erasure. He had brought paperwork. Not fake paperwork, real paperwork. Printed, organized, legal documents prepared in advance. Power of attorney forms, title transfer documents. Notarized, or at least designed to look notarized. Someone had spent time on this. Someone had researched the process. Someone understood that if the paperwork was correct, the crime would be invisible. Schuyler explained what was going to happen. Thomas and Jackie were going to sign the papers. They were going to transfer ownership of the boat. They were going to authorize withdrawals from their bank accounts. They were going to cooperate, and if they cooperated, they would live. This is the lie that makes torture unnecessary. You don't need to hurt people to control them. You just need to offer them hope. The hope that compliance buys survival. The hope that if they do what you want, you'll let them go. The hope that this is about money, not murder. Thomas and Jackie wanted to believe it. Everyone wants to believe it. Because the alternative, the knowledge that cooperation won't save you, makes compliance pointless. And if compliance is pointless, then resistance becomes the only option. And resistance against 3 younger men with weapons, miles from shore, is suicide. So they signed. Thomas signed first. Then Jackie. Their handwriting was shaky. Not because they were old. Because their hands were shaking. Because fear does that. Because the body knows what the mind refuses to accept. The documents were placed in a plastic folder, sealed, protected from water. Schuyler handed them to John Kennedy, who put them in a dry bag. This wasn't improvisation. This was procedure. They'd thought about what happens to paper on a boat. They'd thought about evidence. They'd thought about everything. Next came the bank accounts. Schuyler had account numbers. He had routing numbers. He knew which banks the Hawks used. He had access to a laptop with a satellite internet connection. Expensive, slow, but functional offshore. He logged into their accounts, verified the balances. The Hawks had saved approximately $400,000. Not in investments, not in stocks, in liquid accounts, savings, checking, money they could access immediately, money they'd planned to use for their grandchild's future, for medical expenses, for the rest of their lives. Schuyler began transferring it, not all at once. That would trigger alerts. He moved it in increments, 20,000 here, 30,000 there, splitting it across multiple accounts. Accounts he controlled, accounts that had been opened weeks earlier under false names. This wasn't spontaneous. This was planned, rehearsed, executed. The transfers took time. Satellite internet is slow. Each transaction required authorization. Each authorization required passwords. Schuyler had the passwords because Thomas and Jackie gave them to him. They gave him everything he asked for because he'd promised them they'd live. 2 hours passed. The boat drifted. Engine off. No one was piloting anymore. The vessel moved with the current, with the wind, with the slow rotation of water that never stops. They were now 12 miles offshore, far enough that the coastline was a gray line. Far enough that no one could see them. Far enough that even if someone looked, they'd see nothing unusual. Just a boat. Drifting. Waiting. Schuyler checked the accounts again. Verified the transfers. Confirmed the balances. Everything had moved. $400,000 gone. Redistributed. Digitally erased and rewritten into new identities. He closed the laptop. Looked at Thomas and Jackie. They looked back, still hoping, still thinking that maybe this was over. Maybe he'd take the money and leave. Maybe he'd put them in the dinghy and let them row to shore. Maybe they'd survive this. Schuyler walked to the forward deck, to the anchor locker. He opened it. The anchor was there. 65 pounds of galvanized steel. CQR plow design. Designed to dig into the seabed and hold a 55,000-pound boat against wind and current. Designed to prevent drift. Designed to keep things in place. He pulled it out, dragged it across the deck. The chain followed. Rattling. Heavy. 200 feet of 3/8-inch galvanized links. 1,200 pounds of chain. Enough to reach the bottom in most anchorages. Enough to ensure the anchor doesn't just sink. It plummets. He dragged it to where Thomas and Jackie were sitting. They watched him, still not understanding, still hoping this was something else, still thinking that maybe he was preparing to anchor the boat. Maybe he was checking the equipment. Maybe this had a rational explanation. Alonso brought out rope, not anchor line, not marine-grade cord. Rope, thin, strong. The kind you buy at hardware stores. The kind designed for binding, for securing, for immobilizing. They tied Thomas's hands behind his back, then his ankles. Then they did the same to Jackie. Wrists behind the back, ankles together. Tight enough that movement was impossible. Loose enough that circulation continued. This wasn't about causing pain. This was about preventing escape. Then they tied Thomas and Jackie together, back to back. Rope around their chests, around their waists, around their legs, binding them into a single unit. Two people turned into one object. This is important. This is the detail that matters. They weren't tied separately. They were tied together. Because if you throw two people overboard separately, they can swim. They can float. They can survive for hours. They can be rescued. But if you tie two people together, back to back, they can't swim. They can't float properly. They can't keep their heads above water. They can't help each other. They become weight. They become ballast. And if you tie them to a 65-pound anchor, they become cargo. They become something that sinks. Schuyler attached the anchor to the rope binding them together. Used a shackle. Marine grade. Galvanized steel. The kind that doesn't fail. The kind rated for loads far heavier than two human bodies. Thomas and Jackie were still breathing, still conscious, still aware of what was happening. They didn't scream. They didn't beg. Maybe they were in shock. Maybe they understood that begging wouldn't matter. Maybe they were just tired. Tired of being afraid. Tired of hoping. Tired of the lie that cooperation would save them. The boat was drifting in 180 feet of water. Deep enough that light doesn't reach the bottom. Deep enough that the pressure increases by roughly 6 pounds per square inch for every 10 feet of depth. At 180 feet, the pressure is roughly 80 pounds per square inch. Enough to collapse air cavities. Enough to compress lungs. Enough to make the body smaller. Schuyler and Alonso lifted the anchor, carried it to the rail. Thomas and Jackie were attached to it. They didn't resist. They couldn't resist. They just sat there, bound together, waiting for the inevitable. John Kennedy stood back, watching, not participating in this part. Later, much later, he would testify that he didn't touch the anchor, that he didn't throw it overboard, that he only watched, as if watching absolved him, as if witnessing wasn't complicity. Schuyler counted to 3. He and Alonso lifted the anchor over the rail, held it for a moment, then let go. 65 pounds of steel. 1,200 pounds of chain. 2 human beings bound together. All of it dropped into the Pacific Ocean at once. The anchor fell first, dragging the chain behind it. The chain dragged Thomas and Jackie. They went over the rail. No time to scream. No time to inhale. Just the sudden violent pull of gravity and weight and steel. They hit the water. They went under immediately. Not gradually. Not slowly. Immediately. Because the anchor doesn't float. The chain doesn't float. And 2 elderly people tied back to back, bound to 65 pounds of steel, don't float either. The chain kept falling, kept pulling, kept dragging them down. 10 feet. 20 feet. 40 feet. 60. The light dimmed. The pressure increased. The surface disappeared above them. They were conscious, at least for a while. The human body doesn't die instantly underwater. It fights. It tries to hold its breath. It tries to conserve oxygen. It tries to survive. But you can't hold your breath forever. Eventually, the body overrides the mind. The diaphragm spasms. The lungs demand air. The mouth opens. Water rushes in. Drowning isn't peaceful. It isn't quiet. It's violent. It's panic. It's the body realizing it's dying and doing everything it can to prevent it. But there's nothing to prevent. There's no surface to reach. No air to find. Just water. Just pressure. Just the anchor pulling you deeper. At 180 feet, the anchor hit the bottom. The chain settled. Thomas and Jackie settled. Somewhere in the darkness. Somewhere the light doesn't reach. Somewhere no diver would ever go without planning, equipment, and a reason. Their bodies stayed there. Together. Bound. Weighted. The ocean doesn't preserve bodies well. The pressure, the cold, the marine life, everything conspires to erase. Skin deteriorates. Tissue separates. Bones scatter. Within weeks, there would be nothing recognizable. Within months, there would be nothing findable. The anchor stayed where it fell, holding them, keeping them in place, doing what anchors do. On the surface, the boat drifted, silent, empty. 3 men stood on the deck, breathing hard, saying nothing. The water had already closed over the place where Thomas and Jackie went in. No bubbles, no disturbance, just the slow roll of swell. The ocean had swallowed them and moved on. Schuyler started the engine, turned the boat east, back toward Newport Beach, back toward the coastline, back toward the world where paperwork mattered and signatures transferred ownership, and no one asked questions if the documents were correct. The boat that left the harbor that morning with 5 people aboard would return with 3, and no one, for a while, would notice the math didn't add up. The well-deserved returned to Newport Beach at 4:30 in the afternoon, 6 hours after departure. A normal length for a sea trial, long enough to test the systems, short enough that no one worries. Schuyler Delian piloted the boat into the slip. Alonso Machain handled the dock lines. John Kennedy stayed below, out of sight. They moved with the practiced ease of people who'd done this before. No rushing, no panic. Just the routine motions of docking a boat. No one on the dock paid attention. Boats come and go all day. Marinas are transient spaces. People leave in the morning, return in the afternoon. No one tracks who's aboard. No one counts heads. A 55-foot trawler returning to its slip is background noise. Unremarkable. Invisible. Schuyler secured the boat, locked the cabin, walked down the dock toward the parking lot. Alonso and John followed. They got into a car, drove away. The boat sat empty, quiet, waiting. The Hawks didn't come back, but no one knew that yet. No one was expecting them. They lived aboard, but they also spent time with family, spent nights at their daughter's house. It wasn't unusual for the boat to sit empty for a day or 2. Marinas are full of boats that sit empty. Owners with jobs, owners with obligations, boats waiting for the weekend. The paperwork Schuyler had forced them to sign was already in motion. The power of attorney documents gave him legal authority to act on their behalf, to access their accounts, to transfer assets, to sign contracts, all of it notarized, or appearing to be notarized, offshore. This is where the crime becomes jurisdictional theater. Notarization requires a witness, a licensed official who verifies identity and observes the signing. But notarization offshore exists in a gray space. Maritime law, international waters, documents signed at sea and brought to land. Who verifies? Who checks? The answer is, often, no one. If the paperwork looks correct, if the signatures appear genuine, if the notary seal is present, the system assumes legitimacy. Banks process transfers. Title offices record changes. Insurance companies update policies. The bureaucracy moves forward because bureaucracy is designed to move forward. Schuyler presented the documents at the Department of Motor Vehicles. California registers boats the way it registers cars. Title, registration, transfer of ownership. The DMV clerk looked at the paperwork, checked the signatures, verified the notary seal, stamped the forms, approved the transfer. The well-deserved now legally belonged to Skylar DeLeon. Not stolen, not hijacked. Transferred. Purchased. The official record showed a legitimate transaction. Seller to buyer. Signed, notarized, recorded. He went to the bank next. Presented the power of attorney. Requested access to Thomas and Jackie's accounts. The bank verified the documents, checked the signatures against the ones on file. They matched. Of course they matched. Thomas and Jackie had signed them. Under duress. At gunpoint. But they'd signed them. The bank granted access. Skylar began withdrawing money, not all at once. That would raise flags. He moved it gradually. 10,000 here. 15,000 there. Staying under the reporting thresholds, staying invisible. Within a week, he'd drained the accounts. $400,000. Transferred, dispersed. Converted into cashier's checks, prepaid cards, wire transfers to offshore accounts. The digital trail fragmented. The money dissolved into the financial system the way bodies dissolve into the ocean. Present, but no longer findable. He told people he'd bought a boat. Showed them photos. Invited friends to see it. Took Jennifer and their daughter aboard. Played the role of new owner. Excited. Proud. Living the dream. No one questioned it. Why would they? He had the title. He had the keys. He had possession. Ownership isn't metaphysical. It's bureaucratic. If the paperwork says you own something, you own it. But the Hawks family was beginning to notice the silence. Thomas and Jackie called regularly. Every few days, checking in, sharing updates. They weren't the kind of people who disappeared without explanation. Their daughter, Jolene, tried calling. No answer. She tried again. Still no answer. She drove to the marina, walked to the slip. The boat was there, but locked. She knocked. No response. She asked other boaters if they'd seen her parents. No one had. Not for days. She called the police, reported them missing, gave descriptions, explained their routine, explained that this wasn't like them. The police took the report, filed it, added it to the database. Missing persons. Elderly couple. Last seen November 15th. But missing persons cases are complicated. Adults have the right to disappear. People leave without telling their families. People start new lives. People make choices that look like emergencies but aren't. The police investigate, but cautiously. They look for evidence of foul play. They check hospitals. They check morgues. They check financial activity. The financial activity was the first red flag. Large withdrawals. Account transfers. Unusual patterns. The Hawks had been financially stable for years. Conservative. Predictable. Then suddenly, in the span of a week, their accounts were emptied. The police requested records. Saw the power of attorney. Saw the signature. Saw the notarization. Saw that someone named Skylar DeLeon now controlled their assets. They ran his name. Found his address. Found his criminal record. Fraud, forgery, identity theft, petty crimes stretching back to his teens. They brought him in for questioning. He came willingly, confident, calm. He explained that he'd bought the boat, showed them the title, explained that Thomas and Jackie had signed everything over to him, showed them the paperwork. The detectives asked where Thomas and Jackie were now. Skylar said he didn't know. Said they'd completed the sale and left. Said they mentioned something about Mexico, about traveling, about wanting to disappear for a while. The detectives asked why the Hawks would sell their boat and immediately leave the country without telling their family. Skylar shrugged. Said people do strange things. Said maybe they were having financial trouble. Said maybe they needed the cash quickly. But the detectives weren't convinced. The story had too many holes. The financial transfers were too sudden. The silence was too complete. They kept investigating. They went to the marina, interviewed other boaters, asked if anyone had seen the Hawks recently, asked if anyone had seen them leave the boat on November 15th. No one had. Several people remembered seeing the boat leave that morning with 5 people aboard, but only 3 people returned. The detectives asked Schuyler about this. He admitted he'd taken friends with him on the sea trial. Alonzo McChain, John Kennedy. He said Thomas and Jackie had been fine with it, said they'd approved, said everyone had gotten along. The detectives tracked down Alonzo and John, brought them in separately, interviewed them. Their stories matched Schuyler's. Almost perfectly, too perfectly, rehearsed, coordinated. The kind of alignment that suggests planning rather than truth. But matching stories aren't evidence. Suspicion isn't proof. The detectives had a theory. They believed Thomas and Jackie were dead. They believed Schuyler had killed them. But they didn't have bodies. They didn't have witnesses. They didn't have physical evidence. Maritime murders are notoriously difficult to prosecute. The ocean is vast. Bodies disappear. Evidence washes away. Jurisdiction blurs. If a crime happens in international waters, which agency investigates? Coast Guard? FBI? Local police? The answer depends on where the crime occurred, where the boat was registered, where the suspects live. In this case, the crime happened in U.S. territorial waters, within 12 nautical miles of the coast. That meant federal and state jurisdiction overlapped. The FBI could investigate. So could the Orange County Sheriff's Department. They began working together, slowly, carefully. They searched the boat. The well-deserved was impounded. Forensic teams went through every cabin, every compartment, every surface. They found cleaning supplies, bleach, ammonia, disinfectants, evidence that someone had scrubbed the boat thoroughly. They found no blood, no tissue, no hair that matched Thomas or Jackie. The boat had been cleaned professionally, not just wiped down, sterilized. Someone had understood what forensic investigators look for. Someone had taken the time to erase it. They checked the anchor locker. The primary anchor was missing. 65 pounds of steel. Gone. The chain was there. 200 feet of it. But the anchor itself had been removed. Or lost. Or dropped. This was significant. Anchors don't fall off boats accidentally. They're attached with shackles. Secured with pins. Designed to hold 55,000 pounds of vessel against storms. They don't just disappear. The detectives asked Schuyler about the missing anchor. He said he didn't know. Said maybe Thomas and Jackie had removed it before the sale. Said maybe it was never there. The detectives checked the original listing. The photos showed the anchor clearly. It had been there when the boat was listed. It wasn't there now. They began to form a theory. The theory was simple. Schuyler had taken Thomas and Jackie offshore, forced them to sign the paperwork, killed them, weighted their bodies with the anchor, thrown them overboard, returned to shore, cleaned the boat, filed the paperwork, stolen their money. It was a clean theory, logical, supported by circumstantial evidence. But circumstantial evidence isn't enough for murder charges. Not without bodies, not without witnesses, not without something concrete. The prosecutors faced a dilemma. They believed Schuyler was guilty. The detectives believed it. The evidence pointed to it. But belief isn't conviction. Juries need certainty. They need proof. They need something they can see and touch and understand. The ocean had taken that proof. The ocean had swallowed Thomas and Jackie Hawks. It had swallowed the anchor. It had swallowed the only physical evidence that would matter in court. But the prosecutors decided to move forward anyway. They charged Schuyler DeLeon with 2 counts of first-degree murder, charged Alonzo McChain and John Kennedy as accomplices, charged Jennifer DeLeon with conspiracy. They would build the case without bodies. They would prove murder through behavior, through motive, through the pattern of lies. This is rare. Prosecuting murder without remains. It happens, but infrequently. The legal system prefers certainty, prefers evidence you can photograph. But sometimes the absence of evidence is itself evidence. Sometimes the fact that someone has disappeared completely, suddenly, without explanation, that absence tells the story. The trial began in 2007, 3 years after the murders. The prosecution presented financial records, showed the sudden transfers, showed the drained accounts, showed that Skylar had no legitimate source of income, but suddenly possessed a $250,000 boat and access to hundreds of thousands in cash. They presented the power of attorney documents. Had handwriting experts testify. The signatures were genuine. Thomas and Jackie had signed, but the experts noted the shakiness, the inconsistency, the signs of stress. They testified that these signatures looked like they'd been made under duress. They presented testimony from the Hawks family. Their daughter described their routine, their communication patterns, their plans. She testified that her parents would never have sold the boat and disappeared without telling her, would never have stopped calling, would never have abandoned their grandchild. They presented testimony from other boaters, people who'd seen the well-deserved leave the harbor with 5 people aboard, people who'd seen it return with 3. No one had seen Thomas and Jackie leave the boat. No one had seen them again. They presented evidence of the missing anchor, photos from the original listing showing it clearly, photos from the forensic search showing it gone. They argued that the anchor had been used to weight the bodies, that it had been dropped into the ocean along with Thomas and Jackie. The defense argued that all of this was speculation, that the prosecution had no bodies, no crime scene, no physical evidence. They argued that Thomas and Jackie could have left voluntarily, could have signed the papers willingly, could be living somewhere under assumed names. Unlikely, but possible. And possibility is reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They reviewed the evidence. They reviewed the testimony. They considered the timeline, the financial records, the missing anchor, the silence. They returned a verdict. Guilty. On both counts. First-degree murder. Premeditated. Intentional. Done for financial gain. Skylar DeLeon was sentenced to death. Alonzo Machane received the same. John Kennedy, who'd cooperated and testified, received life without parole. Jennifer DeLeon was convicted of conspiracy and sentenced to 2 life terms. The judge, during sentencing, addressed Skylar directly, talked about the cruelty of the crime, the betrayal of trust, the use of a pregnant wife and infant child to manipulate victims. The judge said that Thomas and Jackie Hawks had done nothing wrong except believe in the goodness of people, and that belief had killed them. Skylar showed no emotion, didn't speak, didn't apologize, just stood there, expressionless. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, death row, where he remains today. Except now, Skylar DeLeon is no longer Skylar DeLeon. In prison, he transitioned, changed his name legally. He's now Skylar Sophia DeLeon. Female pronouns. Hormone treatment. The prison system accommodated the transition. This became a media footnote, a strange postscript to an already strange case. Some people saw it as evidence of deeper psychological issues. Some saw it as manipulation. Some saw it as irrelevant. The victims were still dead. The crime was still committed. The name didn't change the facts. The well-deserved was eventually sold at auction. The proceeds went to the Hawks estate, to their daughter, to their grandchild. The boat went to a new owner, someone who didn't know its history, didn't know what had happened aboard, didn't know that the anchor locker once held the instrument of murder. Boats don't remember. They don't hold trauma. They're just steel and wood and fiberglass. They go where they're pointed. They float. They move, they wait, but the ocean remembers. Somewhere, 180 feet below the surface, off the coast of Newport Beach, two bodies once rested, bound together, weighted, held in place by 65 pounds of steel. The currents moved them eventually. The anchor stayed, but the rope deteriorated. The bodies separated, drifted, scattered. The ocean took them piece by piece, returned them to the system. Bones to sediment, tissue to microbes, identity to anonymity. No diver ever found them. No one ever will. The ocean is too vast, the search area too large, the depth too uncertain. They're gone. Completely. Permanently. All that remains is the story, the paperwork, the trial transcript, the conviction, and a 55-foot trawler that still floats somewhere, carrying a different name, a different owner, a different future. The boat they called well-deserved. The boat came back. The people didn't. That's the detail that haunts maritime investigators. Not the violence, not the method. The simple arithmetic. 5 minus 2 equals 3. And no one noticed immediately because no one was counting. Newport Beach Harbor processes thousands of vessel movements every month. Boats leave, boats return. Harbor master logs record departure times, sometimes. Return times, occasionally. But passenger manifests? Head counts. Those don't exist for private recreational vessels. You're not required to file a float plan for a sea trial. You're not required to report who's aboard. This anonymity is fundamental to boating culture. It's part of the appeal. No one tracking you, no one asking questions. Just you, your vessel, and open water. Freedom means privacy. Privacy means risk. When the well-deserved returned to its slip on November 15th, 2004, at 4:30 in the afternoon, it looked exactly like it should have. A boat returning from a routine outing. Lines handled properly. Fenders deployed. Engines shut down correctly. Everything normal. The three men who returned, Skylar Delian, Alonso Machane, John Kennedy, moved with the casual efficiency of people who belonged. They didn't rush. Didn't look around nervously. Didn't act like they'd just committed murder 7 miles offshore. They acted like buyers who'd completed a sea trial. Satisfied. Ready to finalize the purchase. This is the psychological advantage of audacity. If you act like you belong, most people assume you do. If you move with confidence, most people don't question you. The human brain is wired to detect anxiety, furtiveness, guilt. It's less equipped to detect calm, organized evil. Skylar locked the boat, walked to the parking lot, drove away. The boat sat empty for 3 days before anyone looked for Thomas and Jackie Hawkes. 3 days of silence. 3 days where the crime could have been discovered. Investigated, stopped. But it wasn't, because no one knew to look. The timeline matters here. Understanding what happened when. Understanding the gaps. Understanding what investigators missed and why they missed it. November 15th. The Hawks and DeLeon's group leave Newport Beach Harbor at 10:30 a.m. The boat returns at 4:30 p.m. 6 hours elapsed. No distress calls. No radio traffic. Nothing unusual reported by other vessels in the area. November 16th through 18th. The boat sits in its slip. Silent. Empty. No one boards. No one investigates. The Hawk's daughter tries calling. No answer. This isn't immediately alarming. Her parents sometimes went inland, sometimes stayed with family, sometimes were unreachable for days. November 19th. Jolene Hawkes drives to the marina, finds the boat locked, asks around. No one has seen her parents in days. She feels the first real stab of worry, the kind that sits in your chest and doesn't leave. November 20th. She files a missing persons report with the Newport Beach Police Department, provides photos, describes their habits, routines, medical conditions, explains that they would never disappear without contact. The police take the report seriously. They begin checking hospitals, morgues, hotels. November 21st. Detectives run financial checks. Discover unusual account activity. Large withdrawals, transfers. A power of attorney filed with someone named Skylar DeLeon. They run his name. Find his record. Fraud. Forgery. Theft. The pattern is obvious. November 22nd. Police bring Skylar in for questioning. He comes willingly. Too willingly. Explains the sale. Shows the paperwork. Says the Hawks signed everything voluntarily. Says they left afterward. Says he doesn't know where they went. This is where the investigation slows. Because Skylar's story isn't impossible. Unlikely, but not impossible. People do strange things. People do sell their boats suddenly. People do disappear. The paperwork is real. The signatures are genuine. The transfer was recorded officially. Without bodies, without a crime scene, without witnesses. What do you have? Suspicion. Theory. A story that doesn't quite fit, but not evidence, not proof. The detectives keep working. They interview marina staff, interview other boaters, build a timeline. They discover that 5 people left on the boat. Only 3 returned. This is significant. This is the crack in the story. They bring Alonzo Machane in. Interview him separately. He confirms Skylar's version. Says the Hawks were fine when they left. Says they completed the sea trial. Says Thomas and Jackie left the boat at the dock and walked away. Says he doesn't know where they went. They interview John Kennedy. He tells the same story, almost word for word. This consistency is suspicious. Real memories aren't consistent. They vary. They include different details. They contradict in small ways. Rehearsed stories match perfectly. But matching stories aren't evidence of murder. They're evidence of coordination. Maybe the 3 men agreed on a story because they all witnessed the same events. Maybe they're telling the truth. Maybe. The investigation expands. FBI becomes involved. This is a potential maritime homicide. Federal jurisdiction. They bring resources. Forensic accountants. Behavioral analysts. Marine investigators. They start building a case. They search the boat. Impound it. Process every surface. They're looking for blood, tissue, hair, DNA. Anything that proves violence occurred. They find cleaning supplies, industrial grade, the kind used for deep cleaning, the kind that removes biological traces. They test surfaces anyway. Use luminol. Use alternate light sources. Use every tool in the forensic toolkit. They find nothing. No blood. No tissue. Nothing that indicates a struggle or violence or death. The boat had been scrubbed. Professionally. Thoroughly. Someone understood forensic investigation. Someone knew what needed to be removed. This knowledge is itself incriminating. Innocent people don't sterilize boats. They clean them. They maintain them. They don't erase them. The missing anchor becomes central to the theory. It's gone. Completely. The chain remains. 200 feet of galvanized steel chain coiled in the anchor locker. But the anchor itself, 65 pounds of CQR plow, is absent. Detectives check maritime supply stores. Ask if anyone purchased a replacement anchor recently. No one did. They check the original sale listing. The photos clearly show the anchor in place. It was there when the boat was listed. It disappeared between November 15th and November 19th. 4 days. Somewhere in those 4 days, the anchor vanished. The theory is obvious. It's at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, attached to 2 bodies, holding them down, keeping them from surfacing. But theory isn't evidence. The prosecutors know this. They consult with experts. Can you prosecute murder without a body? Yes. It's rare, but possible. You need overwhelming circumstantial evidence. You need motive, means, opportunity. You need to eliminate reasonable alternatives. They have motive, financial gain. Schuyler Delion was in debt, had no legitimate income, suddenly possessed a $250,000 boat and hundreds of thousands in liquid assets. They have means. 3 younger men against 2 elderly victims. Stun guns, isolation, control. They have opportunity. 6 hours offshore. No witnesses, no oversight, complete privacy. They have behavior, the missing anchor, the scrubbed boat, the coordinated stories, the financial transfers, the silence. They have the absence itself. 2 people who disappear completely, suddenly. At the exact moment, someone else takes possession of their assets. This absence is evidence. Not direct, not physical, but compelling. The prosecutors decide to move forward. Grand jury indictment. 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. Murder for financial gain. Murder involving torture. Both are capital charges in California. The trial is scheduled for 2007. 3 years after the murders. 3 years of investigation. 3 years of building a case without the one thing juries expect: a body. The prosecution's opening statement is direct. They tell the jury that Thomas and Jackie Hawkes are dead. That they were murdered on November 15, 2004, approximately 7 miles off the coast of Newport Beach. That they were forced to sign documents transferring their boat and money to Schuyler Delion. That they were then bound to a 65-pound anchor and thrown alive into the Pacific Ocean. They tell the jury they cannot show them the bodies, cannot show them the crime scene, cannot show them the anchor, but they can show them everything else. The financial trail, the timeline, the lies, the behavior, the absence. The defense's opening statement is equally direct. They tell the jury the prosecution has no bodies, no crime scene, no physical evidence, no witnesses. They tell the jury that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that people disappear voluntarily, that the Hawks could be alive somewhere, that without proof of death, there is no murder. This becomes the central tension of the trial. Can you prove murder when the evidence has been erased? Can you convict based on probability rather than certainty? The prosecution presents their case methodically. Financial experts testify about the account transfers, the sudden withdrawals, the pattern suggesting forced compliance rather than voluntary action. Handwriting experts testify about the signatures. They're genuine. Thomas and Jackie did sign the documents. But the experts note anomalies, pressure variations, shaking, inconsistencies with their normal signing patterns, signs of stress, signs of duress. The Hawks' daughter testifies, describes her parents' routine, their communication habits, their plans. She cries on the stand, explains that her parents would never have disappeared without telling her, would never have abandoned their grandchild, would never have stopped calling. Marina witnesses testify, describe seeing 5 people leave on the boat, describe seeing 3 return, describe seeing the boat sit empty for days, describe Schuyler Delion returning to the boat alone, acting like he owned it, because legally he did. The prosecution presents Schuyler's background, his history of fraud, his pattern of deception, his financial desperation, his previous schemes. They paint a picture of someone who views other people as resources, as obstacles, as means to an end. They present evidence of planning, the power of attorney documents printed before the sea trial, the multiple bank accounts opened in advance, the coordination with accomplices, the purchase of stun guns. This wasn't impulse. This was premeditation. The missing anchor becomes a focal point. They show photos from the listing, show photos from the forensic search, show the empty space where 65 pounds of steel should be, They bring in maritime experts who explain that anchors don't disappear, that they're secured with shackles rated for enormous loads, that removal requires deliberate action. They ask the jury to consider, where is the anchor? If Thomas and Jackie left voluntarily, why take the anchor? If this was a legitimate sale, why is the anchor missing? The implication is clear. The anchor isn't missing, it's precisely where it was put. At the bottom of the ocean. Holding two bodies, the defense presents character witnesses for Schuyler, people who knew him, people who describe him as troubled but not violent. As a dreamer, a schemer, a person who exaggerated and lied but didn't kill. They argue that the financial transfers could have been legitimate. That elderly people sometimes make sudden decisions. That the Hawks could have been desperate for money. That the power of attorney could have been signed willingly. They argue that the missing anchor could have been removed before the sale. That it could have been sold separately. That it could have been lost during a previous trip. That absence of the anchor doesn't prove murder. They argue that without bodies, without a crime scene, without physical evidence, the prosecution is asking the jury to convict based on speculation, on assumption, on probability, not on proof. The jury deliberates for 3 days. They request transcripts of testimony. They request financial records. They request photos of the anchor. They're thorough. They're careful. They understand the weight of what they're deciding. On the 3rd day, they return. Guilty. First-degree murder. Both counts. Special circumstances. Eligible for death penalty. The penalty phase begins. The prosecution argues for death. Presents evidence of torture. Explains that Thomas and Jackie were conscious when they were thrown overboard. That they drowned slowly. That they experienced terror and suffering beyond comprehension. The defense argues for life without parole. Presents mitigating factors. Schuyler's troubled childhood. His mental health issues. His claims of gender dysphoria. His lack of prior violent offenses. The jury deliberates again. Returns with their verdict. Death. Schuyler Delian is sentenced to death by lethal injection. He's transferred to San Quentin State Prison, death row, where he remains today. 20 years later, the appeals process continues. California's death penalty is currently under moratorium. Executions are paused. He may never be executed. He may die of old age first, but the sentence stands. Guilty, murderer, condemned. Alonzo Machane receives the same sentence, death. John Kennedy, who testified against the others, receives life without parole. Jennifer DeLeon receives 2 consecutive life sentences for conspiracy and accessory after the fact. The well-deserved is sold at auction. The proceeds go to the Hawks' estate. The boat goes to a new owner who renames it. It's still sailing somewhere. Different name, different history, different future. Thomas and Jackie Hawks remain at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Somewhere, approximately 7 miles off Newport Beach, in roughly 180 feet of water. Or they did, until the currents moved them, until decomposition separated them, until the ocean reclaimed them. They're gone now, scattered, dissolved. Return to the system that takes everything eventually. The anchor may still be there. 65 pounds of galvanized steel, sitting in the sediment, waiting. A monument to nothing. Evidence that will never be recovered. A tool of security turned into a tool of murder. The case remains a landmark in maritime criminal law. It's studied in law schools, presented at conferences, used as an example of how to prosecute murder without remains, how to build a case from absence, how to prove death when the ocean has erased the evidence. But for the Hawks family, it's not a case study. It's not an example. It's loss. Permanent. Unresolved. They never got to bury Thomas and Jackie. Never got to say goodbye properly. Never got closure in any traditional sense. The ocean took that from them, just like it took Thomas and Jackie. The sea trial remains one of boating's most dangerous rituals. Sellers and buyers, alone together, miles from shore, operating on trust. Most of the time, that trust is warranted. Most of the time, nothing happens. Most of the time, both parties return safely. But not always. The Hawks trusted Schuyler de Leon because he came with a pregnant wife and a baby, because he asked the right questions, because he seemed genuine. Because the alternative, believing that someone would use family as camouflage for murder, was too dark to contemplate. They trusted because humans are built to trust. Because society functions on mutual assumption of good intent. Because suspecting everyone of being capable of murder is paranoia, not wisdom. But sometimes that trust is the trap. Sometimes the smiling buyer is a killer. Sometimes the sea trial is an execution. Sometimes the boat named Well Deserved becomes a floating crime scene, and the only witnesses are the ocean and the anchor and the silence that follows. Thomas and Jackie Hawks deserved better. They deserved to watch their grandchild grow up. They deserved to grow old on land. They deserved to die naturally, peacefully, surrounded by family. Instead, they died in terror, in darkness, in the cold Pacific water, bound together, weighted, dragged down by the very anchor that was supposed to keep them safe. The boat returned without them. The ocean kept them. And somewhere, in the darkness below, the anchor still waits, holding nothing now, just steel and sediment and the memory of what it was used for. The story ends here. But the ocean doesn't end. It continues. It moves. It forgets nothing and remembers nothing. It simply is. And somewhere in that vastness, two people who trusted the wrong stranger became part of the water, part of the current, part of the endless, indifferent blue. The boat was called Well Deserved, but they deserved better.